I will give three speeches over time about three individual Americans who played pivotal historical or scientific roles but are forgotten or overlooked. One is Alfred Loomis, who led the team that developed radar in the Second World War, which was the most important technology after Oppenheimer's. The second is J.J. Gibson, a perceptual psychologist who discovered how people and animals move through their sense of vision, and his influence is vast without anyone knowing. The third person that I'll talk about tonight is from the 1800s, Cassius Clay. And yes, that is the birth name of Muhammad Ali, the boxer. Whether there's a link between them isn't known, but the first Cassius Clay was critical in eliminating slavery in the US and probably pivotal in Russia's elimination of serfdom. This Cassius Clay is not famous. In the 1800s, the Clays were one of the most influential political families in the US. They included a dozen congressmen, 3 senators from the South, Alabama, Kentucky, Virginia. Best known was Henry Clay from Kentucky, who was Speaker of the House, a senator, a Secretary of State. He was a compromiser, supported the gradual elimination of slavery, and he ran for president something like 3 times and lost. His son and nephew, Cassius, served in the Mexican-American War. Junior, his son, was killed, Cassius taken prisoner, and was sympathetic to the Mexican side because it opposed slavery. Cassius was also a Kentucky politician, but he was an abolitionist, and these two things were incompatible. And he was known as a great Bowie knife fighter. He debated the issue, the slavery issue in public, which was unique, introducing a generation of people to ideas they would never have heard. It was very unusual to debate slavery in a slave state. And people tried to kill Cassius in or after these debates. And that's why he was known as a great Bowie knife fighter, because several times he mauled or killed people who tried to kill him in these debates. In fact, his opponents hired an assassin to shoot him, but the bullet hit his knife, which reduced its impact, and then basically Clay tackled the assassination, cut him up, and threw him over an embankment. It was a different time. He started an anti-slavery newspaper in Kentucky, received death threats, and set up 2 large cannons in the newspaper office. So it was like war. Mobs would attack. He would defend. Most white Southerners hated Cassius Clay, and in fact, many still do. But some of them listened because he was a force. There was no one else like him in the South. And the current of history is a little like a river. A big rock in the river makes water flow around it, causes turbulence, erodes the riverbank, and sometimes that can lead the river to flow in a different path. Nationally, Clay wasn't a radical abolitionist, but in the South, which was so skewed politically, he was. And he was a friend of Abraham Lincoln before Lincoln was president. So when Lincoln was elected, he appointed Clay ambassador to Russia. The Civil War broke out, however, before he left, and Clay organized a troop that defended the White House and other DC places from a Confederate attack. Then he went to Russia. In St. Petersburg, he was popular. And by this time, his views on emancipation were quite articulate. Some historians suggest Clay influenced basically his friend, Tsar Alexander II, to abolish serfdom, which Alexander did in the Emancipation Edict of 1861. Clay was certainly instrumental in securing Russia's support for the Union. Alexander sent his fleets to both the east and west coasts of the US, and they had orders to enter the war on the Union side if Britain or France entered on the side of the Confederacy. Like Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy in the US Independence War, which secured French support against Britain, Clay's diplomacy in Russia was more important than any single battle on a field. Britain and France were afraid of a unified US getting powerful, so they supported a split up, even if they didn't support slavery. Lincoln then recalled Clay because he needed Union Army generals, and Clay refused publicly unless Lincoln would emancipate slaves. So then Lincoln sent Clay to border states to test the mood for emancipation, and Clay told Lincoln the public was ready, and Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And Clay became a general for a year. Then he was sent back to Russia to shore up the relationship, and he remained there without his family for 6 years. Clay negotiated the purchase of Alaska from the Russians. How is it that we don't know about this guy? In Russia, Clay developed quite an appreciation of ballet, including a leading ballerina. They had a child, and when Clay returned to the US in 1869, he brought the boy with him. His marriage fell apart, and he became something of a recluse. A notorious recluse, because as an old man, he married a very young woman, and efforts to remove her from his estate did not go well. He still had cannons, and they still fired on target, and she wasn't willing to leave. However, this episode has demoted his reputation in Kentucky and probably elsewhere. And I think it's why we haven't heard anything about him. Now, there may be or may not be some thread of actual ancestry linking the Clays and Muhammad Ali's family. Ali's father was very proud of the name. Of course, Muhammad Ali changed his name when he adopted Islam. And he honestly said he didn't know what strands of ancestry contributed to his skills, didn't really care. But the Cassius Clay of the 1800s was critical in changing border states like Kentucky's attitudes towards slavery. There's a lot of social psychology research that shows a strong, independent, contrarian voice can change a much larger group's views. And this isn't just, or wasn't just standing up and speaking truth. Imagine if after a speech you had to fight your way out of a room against people who tried to kill you. Clay ensured Lincoln's survival when the Civil War broke out, and ensured that England and France didn't enter the war on the Confederacy side. He may have influenced the Tsar to make an emancipation edict, and certainly he influenced Lincoln to make his. He arranged the purchase of the largest state in America. Consider if Russia still controlled Alaska. I hope you will agree with me that America's had two Cassius Clays in its history. One became the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time and was perhaps the most recognized human being on the planet. The earlier Cassius is largely forgotten. Thank you. This speech is about J.J. Gibson. It's my second of 3 speeches about people that you probably haven't heard of, but have had a major impact on us. The first was about Cassius Clay, who in 1800s helped end slavery. And the third will be about Alfred Loomis, a businessman who invented radar. the second most important scientific technology of World War II, after Oppenheimer's. J.J. Gibson also played a critical role in World War II, and his influence extends now. Gibson was a perceptual psychologist. His work continues to revolutionize biology, though few people know his name. His work is the basis of compression algorithms, without which we could not even be using Zoom or streaming media or sharing files. Prior to World War II, perception psychologists believed vision was triggered, well, by optical information, but most of what we see is built in the brain. They thought sophisticated cognitive hardware compares a view with predictions, infers comparisons, amplifies expectations, which ignored that many animals with very limited neural networks use visual systems to move around very successfully. Think of honeybees, who not only identify nectar, a nectar source, and a path over hills and through trees and bushes to get there, they can perform a kind of dance that's a map of what they saw. Bees have very limited neural hardware. In the 30s, these psychologists were much taken with visual illusions, which they thought showed how the brain's elaborate hardware operated. Gibson studied how the new car drivers of the time were managing to drive at high speeds on curvy roads in sunshine, in rain, and at night. And he thought it was ridiculous to think drivers calculated equations governing vast degrees of freedom. He posited that motion itself produced visual information cues. They weren't doing math, they were looking at illustrations. Then World War II started and the Air Force had a problem. People who had never flown in a plane, much less piloted one, had to learn how. They had to fly in any weather, maneuver around other planes, some of which they shot at or shot at them, and they had to land on lousy runways. The Air Force hired these perception psychologists to help select and train candidates. And the first scientists from Harvard and Princeton used classical paintings that showed what was considered perspective clearly, and it failed. They turned to Gibson. He analyzed visual perceptions of pilots and discovered they used optical flow to navigate. And let me share my screen. Pilots, like other organisms that visually perceive, experience reflected light from surfaces they move across. A stream of these reflected facets steadily moves across the eye. We think of geometric shapes as things like cubes and pyramids that are static. But animals move, and the visual world isn't static. The geometric shapes that form during movement are as fundamental as Platonic forms. Gibson's idea was that an animal's perception system is attuned to and fused to what is meaningful in the environment. It's not complex machinery in the head that calculates what we see. Perception directly engages the environment. His approach worked with pilots in World War II. He developed his ideas in a series of books and articles in the 50s and 60s, and although he gained respect and eventually was elected to the American Academy of Science, his work, not his name, became influential. Image compression algorithms are based on optical flow. This picture is a system used in videos. The short arrows in the picture are parts that don't change. The data is not retransmitted every frame. The parts with the longest arrows are changing fastest. That data needs to be transmitted every frame. It's based on Gibson's discovery of optical flow. Gibson coined the term affordance to describe the dynamic visual patterns an organism seeks to survive. Think of someone in a canoe on a river looking for a pattern of trees moving across their visual field. If the trees move too fast, the canoe is too close. Move too slowly, it's too far away. So an affordance is a visual array that makes sense to an organism. After Gibson introduced the concept of affordance, its use took off. Yet very few people know it was based on Gibson. The Nobel laureate Gerald Edelman developed a theory of brain development in which a person's perception of what is important, what Edelman called a perception of value, builds neural networks in the brain. Edelman never mentioned Gibson, but an affordance is a perception of what an organism values. Finally, my appreciation of Gibson developed when I was writing an article about bird color evolution. I suggested optical flows that birds commonly perceive is reflected in their plumage patterns. Incidentally, it also explains why birds are often so colorful. When you fly through trees, it's really useful to see what's very important very easily. In conclusion, I can only scratch the surface about Gibson's influences. There are important books about affordances in design, about optical flows and compression, about pilot training, but there's no book about Gibson. At least you and I know something about him. Thank you. This is my final speech about someone very important in U.S. history who is poorly known. It's about Alfred Loomis, who made a fortune figuring out how to electrify North America. And then he became a leading scientist, building the most sophisticated biophysical lab in the country in his house, where people like Einstein and Fermi hung out. Then as World War II approached, he led the team that invented radar. And he also played a big role in the Manhattan Project. He invented the Loran aircraft navigation system, which was the default aircraft control system until around 2010. There is one book written about Loomis, Tuxedo Park, named for the secluded place his house was in. It's by a member of his extended family, Conant, who has a limited scientific background, so it covers many episodes but isn't very deep. For example, Loomis built the first ultrasound emitter and showed it destroyed bacteria. Conant considers this a clever hobby. This is where I came across Loomis a few years ago. I patented a device that uses a specific light wavelength to kill methanogens in cow stomachs. And the device can include an ultrasound emitter to keep LEDs free of bacteria, as Loomis showed. Not a hobby. Loomis was born wealthy, but he became his era's version of a billionaire. In the early 1900s, utility companies were formed to provide electricity to new industries and the public. But their stocks and bonds were not attractive. They were regulated, local, dependent on unknown public demand. They couldn't accumulate capital and build transmission. Loomis invented the Public Utility Holding Company. It got utility company equity in exchange for financing generators and transmission lines. Loomis's company consolidated operations and interconnected distribution systems, which was key to reliability and reducing costs. The price of electricity dropped. Loomis's company issued their own stock, which soared. He became very rich. By the mid-20s, copycats formed holding companies that did not spread transmission lines, only took profits. Loomis predicted speculators like these would destroy value in his industry and in many. In 1928, he cashed out and was much ridiculed. After the stock market crashed in 29, he bought the blue chips at fire sale prices. And so while most got poorer in the 1930s, Loomis got even richer. Organizing electricity transmission is actually really important. Loomis knew it was critical to boost electrical consumption, like on farms, not just generate power. So he organized a group that funded engineers and land-grant colleges who invented heaters and lights that made farms profitable and generated demand. Today, we have to do the same thing, by the way, roll out high voltage lines across the continent and develop demand for electric vehicles and manufacturing. Loomis was a Republican, but in the 1930s, the Republican Party veered into isolationism and anti-government populism. By the time Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, Loomis allied with the Democratic Roosevelt administration, and this is where the story gets really interesting. During the 1930s, Loomis's lab had advanced acoustic research into radiation, bioelectricity, metrology, microscopy, and sound detection. Loomis was gifted at engineering scientific technology. He invented the first system that measured and brainwaves and discovered EEG patterns of REM activity. He developed technology to analyze radiation spectra and capillary waves. He was the leading US researcher in acoustics. At the same time, his cousin and close friend, Henry Stimson, another Republican who joined the Roosevelt administration and became Secretary of War during World War II, Loomis had made Stimson rich, and Stimson was Loomis's oldest friend. Also at the same time, in the 1939 and 40 period, the US was supplying arms to England, and these boats were being sunk at astronomical rates by German U-boats. There was no way a US could fight a war in Europe if the majority of soldiers would die before getting there. So Loomis was put in charge of defense research for microwaves. He bought a building on the MIT campus and turned it into the radiation lab, or RAD lab, and funded it until the government did. He partnered with Ernest Lawrence in doing this. Lawrence is the guy who developed the cyclotron at Lawrence Labs here in Berkeley. Within a year, the MIT RAD lab had invented radar that could detect U-boats and target them. It spotted German airplanes before they reached England and enabled cover for D-Day. It has been said that the atomic bomb ended World War II, but radar won it. Loomis provided the scientific basis, organized and funded radar's development. Loomis also helped finance Lawrence's cyclotron in Berkeley and was involved in the development of the cyclotrons that produced the atomic bomb material in Tennessee. During the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, Lawrence, Groves, and Loomis would discuss what needed doing, and then they would tell Secretary of War Stimson, or rather Loomis would tell Stimson, his cousin and friend. It would get done without red tape. When Lawrence needed big amounts of copper, Loomis fixed it with the Guggenheims, who controlled copper. Lawrence needed huge amounts of iron. Loomis arranged it with the chairman of U.S. Steel. At the end of World War II, Loomis developed LORAN. It was the global method of aircraft navigation used by all commercial aircraft until the advent of GPS around 2000. Even the Soviet Union. Loomis held the patent on LORAN. It's too bad Ashwin Ramanan isn't here because it includes something Starlink might appreciate. 3 stations are timed with their own crystals, and the middle station is called a master. The other stations adjust their oscillators, crystal oscillators, to remain in sync with the master. And the master is part of several triads. So if the station's signal fades, it could be bridged. Why haven't you heard of Loomis? He wanted it that way. The physicists of his era knew how important he was. Einstein and Oppenheimer, Luis Alvarez, one of the most brilliant scientists, physicists of the 20th century, wanted to use radar in a system to land planes without visibility. Loomis overcame the scientific hurdles to make it possible and the moral and financial support to overcome failures. Alvarez considered him a great man and a friend. Lawrence wrote that had Loomis not existed, radar would not have advanced. Business and political leaders knew it. Franklin Roosevelt, said that after Winston Churchill, Loomis was the civilian who contributed most to World War II's victory. Loomis didn't need history. He was known by those who mattered to him. After the war, he scandalized high society by divorcing his first wife, who was in a sanitarium. He remarried, moved to a small house at the end of Long Island, and focused on his children. He never gave an interview. His great-grandson is Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix. Hastings' mother's maiden name is Loomis. Perhaps Netflix should consider a series about Alfred Loomis, or maybe Reed Hastings knows Loomis wouldn't want it. Thank you.